Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't see anyone with bandages on, so hopefully the segue trials went well. I'm going to talk about equity a little different, and this is from a rural and frontier context and how we provide mobility to people in very rural areas. Worked with two other folks, Jaydeep Chadhari and Alexander Vasquez, on this project. Oops, that's the wrong one. So as we talk about the project, this is work we did for the Wyoming Department of Transportation. We'll talk about the project, the lit review we did, survey results from what we did. We talked about a corridor study looking at adding some new services in Wyoming and then next steps. So we wanted to provide the state with a current assessment of their intercity bus services. A lot of people know that over the years, intercity bus has really pulled back to major metropolitan areas and certainly through rural states, mostly on the interstate as they're going somewhere else. So a lot of rural states have seen pretty significant reductions in intercity bus service. So as we looked at that assessment, we wanted to provide YDOT a methodology that they could use in future years to look at intercity bus services and analyze if it's improving, if it's staying the same or being reduced. And then we also wanted to provide some potential routes for them to look at where maybe the greatest need is. So Wyoming is a very rural or even a frontier state. When you look at the US Census Bureau data, only 28 of the 99 cities and towns they list in Wyoming are over 2,000 people. So the population is pretty spread out, and even the towns that do exist are really small, which makes it hard to run good bus service. What we did find, though, in the analysis is that about half of the whole state's population is covered by national intercity bus providers. And 17 of the 28 largest cities have intercity bus service, so it wasn't quite as bleak as we had thought. And the lack of service is primarily in the central and eastern parts of the state. So there was a route that used to come down through the center part of the state that got cut just before we started the study. So this is I-25 coming down to Denver and up, and then I-90 coming across into South Dakota. So this is a big part that doesn't have service here, and then even the far eastern part of the state over here. So when we talked about different literature that's relevant, obviously the federal regulations, the FTA Circular 9040 Part 1G talks about intercity bus service and how the federal government defines it, how they view you should be spending your money on it. The KFH group did a report in 2002 talking about rural intercity bus service needs, and then through the NCHRP talked about, again, state rural intercity bus strategies and their utilization. The intercity bus funding is known as FTA Section 5311F, and so that is the funding source that most states use for funding their intercity bus services. A lot of states with the reduction in intercity bus service have done their own studies. So these are some of the ones that have been done fairly recently before we did our work in Wyoming. And so again, you tend to see it in the more rural states, and certainly the states with large land areas and maybe not as high population densities. We did a specific survey of different states we thought would be similar to Wyoming. So ones, primarily in the West, again, large land states with tends to be lower population densities. We also did a rider survey. We had researchers out at different bus stops, intercity bus stops in Wyoming, and so as people got off the buses, we approached them about filling out a survey. These are some of those results. Most of them were using the bus to get to family or friends. They might have been relocating or returning home, attending a funeral, or going home to take care of parents. Most use the internet to find the services they are looking for. 62% of the Wyoming residents who are riding, so we separated these people out from anyone else who was kind of riding through. So 62% of those Wyoming residents riding were satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the information that was available. However, only about 46% of those folks were satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the amount of service, the frequency of service. 31% were neutral and 23% were somewhat dissatisfied or dissatisfied. So the majority of folks weren't really happy with the amount of service coming through. Again, most of the service that's coming through is headed to Denver, Salt Lake City, eventually over to Seattle or to Minneapolis. Why most of the people ride? A lot of the people riding are because they kind of have to. They have a lack of access to a vehicle. They don't have the ability to drive, and certainly even with gas prices being relatively low, because we just did this a couple of years ago talking about gas prices. And over 2/3 of the people, roughly 2/3 of the people had a household income of less than $30,000 per year. So those longer trips in their own vehicle might be very expensive for them, and so that's why they're getting on an intercity bus. We talked to, or we surveyed transit systems within the state of Wyoming and asked them, how well they feel they're taking care of different levels of service. So within local service, about 1/3 said they're doing very well with providing local service, about 1/3 somewhat well, 1/3 about neutral, few folks saying they weren't doing quite so well. Obviously, when we get into the intercity service, the majority of people are saying that it's not going very well. And so again, we see this need for maybe more intercity bus service within the state. So one of the things we asked on this survey was, where are there needs for improvement or potential new services? So some of the bigger communities, Casper, Cody, where are those people typically traveling to? Some of it is even to communities in other states. So a lot of people, Cody and Powell, which is in northwest Wyoming, are going up to Billings, Montana for shopping or medical care or other things. And so this helped us again as we talked about what corridors might be potential for new service. So we took all the data and put it into basically a proposed new routes or new services for the state to consider. One of the things we looked at again when we were looking at trying to get communities with at least 2,000 people in them connected into the intercity bus network. So as we talked about routes from say like Lander, Riverton into Casper, here's the populations of those communities. As you can see, some are still pretty small, but maybe connecting that through a little larger community makes that route make a little more sense. So basically we came up with about 6 new proposed routes for the DOT to consider spending or funding. So what we put as a goal for the state is to have 85%, which would be 24 of its 28 largest cities, have intercity bus service or at least connect to a larger city where people could then get on intercity bus service. Explore those opportunities to enhance connections. So maybe right now you have that connection to intercity bus service, but you could enhance that. It might be something that's only a one-time-a-day connection, so perhaps more frequency to get people to either a morning or an evening connection to intercity bus. One of the things that the feds use, a great nebulous term talking about intercity bus or making connections, meaningful connections to other services. And so That's one that's kind of nebulous, and we provided some guidance on that. And obviously, to adopt and review intercity bus services on a regular basis, perhaps at least every 2 years. And again, we gave them that methodology to review it. And, obviously the federal regulations are always changing, and make sure that they review and update those connections and definitions. So that's it. I think we're holding questions till the end. So thank you.